Hello and welcome guys to another video, and today we have the GT4 series at Miami, and this is for week 7 of the iRacing schedule. Now this is going to be the last GT4 guide for the foreseeable future. We're switching over to the GT3 Sprint series and the Porsche Cup series solely for the rest of the season over at Premier Setups. So if you guys want to get some of those setups, check the link down below, and for the next guides it will be either GT3 Sprint or Porsche Cup. But for now, let's have a look at the Hotlap, and then we'll have a look at the guide. So now that we've had a look at that lap, let's have a look at the guide. So this is a very long track for the GT4, so I think this is the longest we've done all season. Just over 2 minutes. So looking at the first corner, we're braking just as we go under this overpass at the top. So braking down the gears, all the way down into first gear for the first corner, and turning in just before we pass that light box above us. Down into first gear here, getting a really late apex, and getting on the power just as we get off the curb here. So just as we get off the curb onto the power. Now for this left-hander coming up, we want to just lift off the power after we shift into third gear. So there's a little line here for pit exit. Just before we get to that, we want to shift up into third gear, lift off the power, and then put the left front on the inside of this red and white curbing, and that's going to hook the car round to the left, and then as we come off that curb, then just modulate the power through this right-hander. Just before we get under this overpass here, again we want to get back on the brakes, only a little brake, just like 3% there, barely anything. You could just lift if you want to instead. Now back onto the throttle, but as you see, just progressively, it's a very long right-hander, so the rear will want to slide initially, so you just have to feel for the grip on the rear tires. Once the grip is there, then start to fully accelerate, and just carry as much momentum as possible through this corner and just keep the car really nice and stable. Now for this left-hander coming up, we're looking at the right, and between this 50-meter board and the start of this blue advertising board on the concrete is where we want to brake. So about halfway between those two markers, and we turn in just as we get to that advertising board for Miami circuit, down into third gear, and we're going to get nice and close to this red and white curbing on the inside, and we basically want to put the left front on this bit of the curb. We don't want to go up here because that's going to unstable it. We're at 147 kilometers an hour. So if we go up onto a high curb like this, at this point, it's just going to unsettle the car a bit too much. So stay just off that curb. Modulating the power again, and then we get on the brakes, just a little tap of the brakes at this point. There isn't really a reference. You can see that we want to be on the brakes before we get to the start of that curb. But then what you can use as a reference is as we trail on the brakes on this curb, is this orange marker on the barrier. That's the reference to get off the brakes and onto the power again. That's the switchover point. So you can use that as a reference. There's just not really a braking reference for that corner. So in third gear, and again, notice the progressive power, not slamming onto the power, very progressive power application. It's also a very hot track for this week, 42 degrees. So the tires are going to heat up if you're too aggressive with the power. Now for this left-hander, we want to lift just after this curb on the left-hand side starts. Just after that, we want to lift, tiny touch of the brakes, and all the way to the left side of this curb, really cutting that as much as the track limits will allow us. Then get back on the power, and as you see, there's this tarmac here on the left, and it ends over here and joins to this blue tarmac. That's where we want to aim to place the car. So as you see, a little bit of the braking, and we're actually trying to push the car over to this side of the track to open up this left-hander. Down into second gear, still on the brakes, and as you see, we're now on the right side of the track, turning in and off the brakes still, and then we get on the power at this point and we're aiming for this bollard on the inside here. Now that is the apex point. We're not actually using the curb there, we're just using that as our apex reference. Open up the steering wheel, and we're actually going to use this raised curb on the right hand side, and we're going to put a wheel either side of it, so it's not really going to unsettle the car too much, but is allow us to open up the exit of the corner. Very nice and early. Now this long straight here, just a little right kink, just put it on the right side of the track to make it nice and short, then again over to the left, full throttle, just don't scrub any speed off unnecessarily. So now for this technical section of corners, we're looking at the 200 and the 150 meter board, and we're braking about halfway between those two boards. Getting on the brakes, and then we're turning in just before this 50 meter board. Braking down into second gear, and we're getting as close to that apex curb as possible. We're not actually putting the left front on the inside of it, just getting it as close as possible without unsettling the car. And then we get on the power just after we pass that curb, and then bring it over to the right, and we want to put the red and white curbing basically in the middle of the car. Little bit of braking just after we get over this curb. So just after that curb, we want to get onto the brakes, or just before the end of this barrier, whichever is a better reference for you to use. Second gear, and we want to hold it to the right here. It's basically a long sweeping hairpin. And then there's another marker to get on the power here. You'll notice this red and white curbing starts here. So just as we start to see that, that is when we get on the power. So just as that comes into vision, that's when we want to get onto the power again. But as you see, it's not straight up to 100%, it's about 50% throttle, and then we go up to about 70%, and then 100%. So again, it's really progressive throttle. Now for the second part of this corner, we're bringing it over to the left, and we turn in just before we go under this walkway. So just before we go under that, we turn in, and then we lift off the throttle just as we go through the shadow of that. But again, it's not a full lift off, it was only to about 60%. And then just as this curb ends on the left hand side, then we get off the throttle completely. Down into second gear, a little bit of the brakes just before we get to the end of this advertising board. We want to get on the brakes, little bit of braking, only about 10%, and we want to get as close to this concrete as possible, as close as possible to this concrete, and then we're basically trying to put the right side of the car as close to this bollard as possible. Getting on the power just as we go past that line of the concrete, and thanks to this hand being in the way, we can't see the bollard, and now we can. And as you see, we want to get the right side of the car just as close as possible to that. Modulating the power, a little bit of a lift, because we then want to bring it over to the right. This is a very technical section of corners. So bring it over to the right. Get on the power just before we get to the start of this red and white curbing. Then we want to brake just about a car length before it. Braking, second gear, then into first gear. Turning in before this curb ends. And there's an orange marker on the concrete on the left side. But for the apex, we want to use this bollard get as close to it as possible. We can put the left side over that sausage curb, then get on the power nice and early and open up the steering wheel for this long straight. Now we'll skip through this straight because it's just a really long straight. And now we're looking at this final hairpin. So we brake as we pass this 200 meter board. So as we pass that board, get onto the brakes, down through the gears. Quite a tight hairpin here. So we're looking at the right hand side, and then we're turning in just after we pass the end of this advertising board. So just after we pass that, we want to turn into the corner, into first gear now, and we're getting as close as possible to this curb, using a little bit of that sausage curb, and then get onto the power and open up the steering wheel as early as possible to try and gain as much speed to go on to this next straight. For this left-hander, it's full throttle, just use a little bit of this curb. We don't want to use too much of it, otherwise it will unsettle the car. And just try not to scrub off any speed. As soon as we get around that curb, we're immediately aiming for this curb over on the right-hand side. And again, it's full throttle, but we just want to try not to scrub off any speed. So put the right side of the car over this curb. That'll help us to pull the car around and not use too much steering angle. But that is it for the guide, guys. As always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and see you again next time.